The St.Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572 was a targeted group of assassinations and a wave of Catholic mob violence, directed against the Huguenots during the French Wars of Religion, traditionally believed to have been instigated by Catherine de Medici, the mother of King Charles IX. The massacre took place 5 days after the wedding of the king's sister Margaret to the Protestant Henry III of Navarre. This marriage was an occasion for which many of the most wealthy and prominent Huguenots had gathered in largely Catholic Paris. The massacre began in the night of 23–24 August 1572, 2 days after the attempted assassination of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the military and political leader of the Huguenots. The king ordered the killing of a group of Huguenot leaders, including Coligny, and the slaughter spread throughout Paris. Lasting several weeks, the massacre expanded outward to other urban centers and the countryside. Modern estimates for the number of dead across France vary widely, from 5,000 to 30,000. The massacre also marked a turning point in the French Wars of Religion. The Huguenot political movement was crippled by the loss of many of its prominent aristocratic leaders, as well as many reconversions by the rank-and-file, and those who remained were increasingly radicalized. Though by no means unique, it was the worst of the century's religious massacres. Throughout Europe, it printed on Protestant minds the indelible conviction that Catholicism was a bloody and treacherous religion. Hans J. Hillebrand, in his Encyclopedia of Protestantism, 4-volume set, claims the Huguenot community reached as much as 10% of the French population on the eve of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, declining to 7 to 8% by the end of the 16th century, and further after heavy persecution began once again with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes by Louis XIV of France. Background: the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day was the culmination of a series of events. The Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which put an end to the Third War of Religion on 8 August 1570. The marriage between Henry III of Navarre and Margaret of Valois on 18 August 1572. The failed assassination of Admiral de Coligny on 22 August 1572. An unacceptable peace and an unacceptable marriage. The Peace of Saint-Germain put an end to 3 years of terrible civil war between Catholics and Protestants. This peace, however, was precarious since the more intransigent Catholics refused to accept it, with the Guise family, who led this faction, out of favor at the French court. The Huguenot leader Admiral Gaspard de Coligny was readmitted into the King's Council in September 1571. Staunch Catholics were shocked by the return of Protestants to the court, but the Queen Mother Catherine de Medici and her son Charles IX were determined not to let war break out again. They were also conscious of the kingdom's financial difficulties, which led them to uphold the peace and remain on friendly terms with Coligny. The Huguenots were in a strong defensive position as they controlled the fortified towns of La Rochelle, La Charité-sur-Loire, Cognac, and Montauban. To cement the peace between the two religious parties, Catherine planned to marry her daughter Margaret to the Protestant Prince Henry of Navarre. The royal marriage was arranged for the 18th of August 1572. It was not accepted by traditionalist Catholics or by the Pope. Both the Pope and King Philip II of Spain strongly condemned Catherine's policy. Tension in Paris. The impending marriage led to the gathering of a large number of well-born Protestants in Paris, who had come to escort the prince. But Paris was a violently anti-Huguenot city, and Parisians, who tended to be extreme Catholics, found their presence unacceptable. Encouraged by Catholic preachers, they were horrified at the marriage of a princess of France with a Protestant. The Parliament of Paris itself decided to snub the marriage ceremony. Compounding this bad feeling was the fact that the harvests had been poor and taxes had risen. The rise in food prices and the luxury displayed on the occasion of the royal wedding increased tensions among the common people. A particular point of tension was an open-air cross erected on the site of the house of Philippe de Gastines, a Huguenot who had been executed in 1569. The mob had torn down his house and erected a large wooden cross on a stone base. Under the terms of the peace, and after considerable popular resistance, this had been removed in December 1571, which had already led to about 50 deaths in riots, as well as mob destruction of property. In the massacres of August, the relatives of the Gastines family were among the first to be killed by the mob. The court itself was extremely divided. Catherine had not obtained the Pope Gregory XIII's permission to celebrate this irregular marriage. Consequently, the French prelates hesitated over which attitude to adopt. It took all the Queen Mother's skill to convince the Cardinal de Bourbon to marry the couple. Beside this, the rivalries between the leading families re-emerged. The Guises were not prepared to make way for the rivals. The House of Montmorency, François, Duke of Montmorency and Governor of Paris, was unable to control the disturbances in the city. Faced with a dangerous situation in Paris, he elected to leave town a few days before the wedding. Shift in Huguenot thought. In the years preceding the massacre, Huguenot political rhetoric had for the first time taken a tone against not just the policies of a particular monarch of France, but monarchy in general. In part this was led by an apparent change in stance by John Calvin in his readings on the prophet Daniel, a book of 1561, in which he had argued that when kings disobey God, they automatically abdicate the worldly power, a change from his views in earlier works that even ungodly kings should be obeyed. This change was soon picked up by Huguenot writers, who began to expand on Calvin and promote the idea of the sovereignty of the people, ideas to which Catholic writers and preachers responded fiercely. Nevertheless, it was only in the aftermath of the massacre that anti-monarchical ideas found widespread support from Huguenots. Among the monarchomics and others, Huguenot writers, who had previously, for the most part, paraded the loyalty to the crown, now called for the deposition or assassination of a godless king who had either authorized or permitted the slaughter. Thus, the massacre marked the beginning of a new form of French Protestantism, one that was openly at war with the crown. This was much more than a war against the policies of the crown. As in the first three civil wars, it was a campaign against the very existence of the Gallican monarchy itself. Huguenot intervention in the Netherlands. Tensions were further raised when in May 1572 the news reached Paris that a French Huguenot army under Louis of Nassau had crossed from France to the Netherlandish province of Hainaut and captured the Catholic strongholds of Mons and Valenciennes. Louis governed the Principality of Orange around Avignon in southern France for his brother William the Silent, who was leading the Dutch revolt against the Spanish. This intervention threatened to involve France in that war. Many Catholics believed that Coligny had again persuaded the king to intervene on the side of the Dutch, as he had managed to do the previous October, before Catherine had got the decision reversed. The attempted assassination of Admiral de Coligny after the wedding on the 18th of August 1572. Coligny and the leading Huguenots remained in Paris in order to discuss some outstanding grievances about the Peace of Saint-Germain with the king. On the 22nd of August, an attempt was made on Coligny's life as he made his way back to his house from the Louvre. He was shot from an upstairs window and seriously wounded. The would-be assassin, Margaret, escaped in the ensuing confusion, and it is still difficult today to decide who was ultimately responsible for the attack. History records three possible candidates: the Guises, the Cardinal of Lorraine, and his nephews, the Dukes of Guise and Aumale, are the most likely suspects. The leaders of the Catholic party, they wanted to avenge the death of the two dukes, Father Francis, Duke of Guise, whose assassination 10 years earlier they believed to have been ordered by Coligny. The shot aimed at Admiral de Coligny came from a house belonging to the Guises. The Duke of Alba, he governed the Netherlands on behalf of Philip II. Coligny planned to lead a campaign in the Netherlands to participate in the Dutch revolt to free the region from Spanish control. During the summer, Coligny had secretly dispatched a number of troops to help the Protestants in Mons, who were now besieged by the Duke of Alba. So Admiral de Coligny was a real threat to the latter. Catherine de Medici. According to tradition, the Queen Mother had been worried that the king was increasingly becoming dominated by Coligny. Amongst other things, Catherine reportedly feared that Coligny's influence would drag France into a war with Spain over the Netherlands. The massacres. Paris. The attempted assassination of Coligny triggered the crisis that led to the massacre. Admiral de Coligny was the most respected Huguenot leader and enjoyed a close relationship with the king, although he was distrusted by the king's mother. Aware of the danger of reprisals from the Protestants, the king and his court visited Coligny on his sickbed and promised him that the culprits would be punished. While the Queen Mother was eating dinner, Protestants burst in to demand justice, some talking in menacing terms. Fears of Huguenot reprisals grew. Coligny's brother-in-law led a 4,000-strong army camp just outside Paris, and, although there is no evidence it was planning to attack, Catholics in the city feared it might take revenge on the Guises of the city populace itself. That evening, Catherine held a meeting at the Tuileries Palace with her Italian advisers, including Albert de Gondi, Comte de Retz. On the evening of the 23rd of August, Catherine went to see the king to discuss the crisis. Though no details of the meeting survive, Charles IX and his mother took the decision to eliminate the Protestant leaders. Holt speculates perhaps between 2 and 3 dozen noblemen who were still in Paris. Other historians are reluctant to speculate on the composition or size of the group of leaders targeted at this point, beyond the few obvious heads. Most potential candidates were accompanied by groups of gentlemen as staff and bodyguards like Coligny. So, each killing of a leader could have been expected to involve killing these as well. Shortly after this decision, the municipal authorities of Paris were summoned. They were ordered to shut the city gates and to arm the citizenry in order to prevent any attempt at a Protestant uprising. The King's Swiss Guard was given the task of killing a list of leading Protestants. It is difficult today to determine the exact chronology of events and to know the moment the killing began. It seems a signal was given by ringing bells for matins at the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, near the Louvre, which was the parish church of the kings of France. Before this, the Swiss Guards had expelled the Protestant nobles from the Louvre castle and then slaughtered them in the streets. A group led by Guise in person dragged Admiral Coligny from his bed, killed him, and threw his body out of the window. Huguenot nobles in the building had first put up a fight. Although the Huguenot nobles were terrified for the life of the leader, one of Coligny's murderers recognized his fearlessness of his fate by stating that he never saw anyone less afraid in so great a peril, nor die more steadfastly. The tension that had been building since the Peace of Saint-Germain now exploded in a wave of popular violence. The common people began to hunt Protestants throughout the city, including women and children. Chains were used to block streets so that Protestants could not escape from the houses. The bodies of the dead were collected in carts and thrown into the Seine. The massacre in Paris lasted 3 days despite the king's attempts to stop it. Holt concluded concludes that, while the general massacre might have been prevented, there is no evidence that it was intended by any of the elites at court, listing a number of cases where Catholic courtiers intervened to save individual Protestants who were not in the leadership. The two leading Huguenot princes, Henry of Navarre and his cousin the Prince of Condé, were spared as they pledged to convert to Catholicism. Both would renounce the conversions when they had escaped Paris. According to some interpretations, the survival of these princes was a key point in Catherine's overall scheme to prevent the House of Guise from becoming too powerful. On August 26, the king and court established the official version of events by going to the Paris Parliament, holding a lit de justice. Charles declared that he had ordered the massacre in order to thwart a Huguenot plot against the royal family. A Jubilee celebration, including a procession, was then held, while the killings continued in parts of the city. In the provinces, although Charles had dispatched orders to his provincial governors on August 24 to prevent violence and maintain the terms of the 1570 edict, from August to October, similar massacres of Huguenots took place in a total of 12 other cities: Toulouse, Bordeaux, Lyon, Bourges, Rouen, Orléans, Meaux, Angers, La Charité, Saumur, Gaillac and Troyes. In most of them, the killings swiftly followed the arrival of the news of the Paris massacre, but in some places there was a delay of more than a month. According to Mac P. Holt, all 12 cities where provincial massacres occurred had one striking feature in common: they were all cities with Catholic majorities where there had once been significant Protestant minorities. All of them had also experienced serious religious division during the first 3 civil wars. Moreover, 7 of them shared a previous experience, had actually been taken over by Protestant minorities during the First Civil War. In several cases, the Catholic party in the city believed they had received orders from the king to begin the massacre, some conveyed by visitors to the city, and in other cases apparently coming from a local nobleman or his agent. It seems unlikely any such orders came from the king, although the Guise faction may have desired the massacres. Apparently genuine letters from the Duke of Anjou, the king's younger brother, did urge massacres in the king's name in Nantes. The mayor fortunately held on to his without publicizing it until a week later, when contrary orders from the king had arrived. In some cities the massacres were led by the mob, while the city authorities tried to suppress them, and in others small groups of soldiers and officials began rounding up Protestants with little mob involvement. In Bordeaux, the inflammatory sermon on September 29 of a Jesuit, Edmond Auger, encouraged the massacre that was to occur a few days later. In the cities affected, the loss to the Huguenot communities after the massacres was numerically far larger than those actually killed. In the following weeks there were mass conversions to Catholicism, apparently in response to the threatening atmosphere for Huguenots in these cities. In Rouen, where some hundreds were killed, the Huguenot community shrank from 16,500 to fewer than 3,000, mainly as a result of conversions and emigration to safer cities or countries. Some cities which were not affected at all by the violence nevertheless also witnessed a sharp decline in the Huguenot population. Soon afterward, both sides prepared for a fourth civil war, which began before the end of the year. Death toll. Estimates of the number that perished in the massacres have varied from 2,000 by a Roman Catholic apologist to 70,000 by the contemporary Huguenot Duc de Sully, who himself barely escaped death. Accurate figures for casualties have never been compiled, and, even in writings by modern historians, there is a considerable range, though the more specialized the historian, the lower they tend to be. At the low end are figures of about 2,000 in Paris and 3,000 in the provinces. The latter figure an estimate by Philip Benedict in an article in 1978. Other estimates are about 10,000 in total, with about 3,000 in Paris and 7,000 in the provinces. At the higher end are total figures of up to 20,000 or 30,000 in total, from a contemporary, non-partisan guesstimate, quoted by the historians Felipe Fernandez Armesto and D. Wilson. For Paris, the only hard figure is a payment by the city to workmen for collecting and burying 1,100 bodies washed up on the banks of the Seine downstream from the city in 1 week. Body counts relating to other payments are computed from this. Among the slain were the philosopher Petrus Ramus, and in Lyon the composer Claude Gaudamel. The corpses floating down the Rhône from Lyons are said to have put the people of Arles off drinking the water for 3 months. Reactions. The politics were horrified, but many Catholics inside and outside France initially regarded the massacres as deliverance from an imminent Huguenot coup d'état. The severed head of Coligny was apparently dispatched to Pope Gregory XIII, though it got no further than Lyons, and Pope Gregory XIII sent the king a golden rose. The Pope ordered a Te Deum to be sung as a special thanksgiving and had a medal struck with the motto Huguenotorum Strages 1572, showing an angel bearing a cross and sword, before which are the felled Protestants. Pope Gregory XIII also commissioned the artist Giorgio Vasari to paint 3 frescoes in the Sala Regia depicting the wounding of Coligny, his death, and Charles IX before Parliament, matching those commemorating the defeat of the Turks at the Battle of Lepanto. The massacre was interpreted as an act of divine retribution. Coligny was considered a threat to Christendom, and thus Pope Gregory XIII designated the 11th of September 1572 as a joint commemoration of the Battle of Lepanto and the massacre of the Huguenots. Although these formal acts of rejoicing in Rome were not repudiated publicly, misgivings in the papal curia grew as the true nature of the killings gradually became better known. Pope Gregory XIII himself refused to receive Charles de Maurevert, said to be the killer of Coligny, on the grounds he was a murderer. On hearing of the slaughter, Philip II of Spain laughed for the only time on record. In Paris, the poet Jean-Antoine de Baif, founder of the Académie de Musique et de Poésie, wrote a sonnet extravagantly praising the killings. On the other hand, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II, King Charles's father-in-law, was sickened, describing the massacre as shameful. Moderate French Catholics also began to wonder whether religious uniformity was worth the price of such bloodshed, and they began to swell the ranks of a movement, the Politiques, which placed national unity above sectarian interests. The massacre caused a major international crisis. Protestant countries were horrified at the events, and only the concentrated efforts of Catherine's ambassadors, including a special mission by Gondi, prevented the collapse of her policy of remaining on good terms with them. Elizabeth I of England's ambassador to France at the time, Sir Francis Walsingham, barely escaped with his life. Even Tsar Ivan the Terrible expressed horror at the carnage in a letter to the emperor. The massacre spawned a pullulating mass of polemical literature, bubbling with theories, prejudices and phobias. Many Catholic authors were exultant in the praise of the king for his bold and decisive action against the supposed Huguenot coup, whose details were now fleshed out in officially sponsored works, though the larger mob massacres were somewhat deprecated. Must excuse the people's fury moved by a laudable zeal which is difficult to restrain once it has been stirred up. Huguenot works understandably dwelt on the harrowing details of violence, expounded various conspiracy theories that the royal court had long planned the massacres, and often showed extravagant anti-Italian feelings directed at Catherine, Gondi, and other Italians at court. Diplomatic correspondence was readier than published polemics to recognize the unplanned and chaotic nature of the events, which also emerged emerged from several accounts in memoirs published over the following years by witnesses to the events at court, including two dramatic and influential accounts by members of the royal family that were not recognized as fake until the 19th century, those supposedly by Margaret of Navarre and Anjou. Anjou's supposed account was the source of the quotation attributed to Charles IX. "Well then, so be it. Kill them, but kill them all. Don't leave a single one alive to reproach me." The author of the Lettre de Pierre Charpentier was not only a Protestant of sorts, and thus, apparently, writing with inside knowledge, but also an extreme apologist for the massacre, in his view, a well-merited punishment for years of civil disobedience, secret sedition. A strand of Catholic writing, especially by Italian authors, broke from the official French line to applaud the massacre as precisely a brilliant stratagem, deliberately planned from various points beforehand. The most extreme of these writers was Camillo Capilupi, a papal secretary, whose work insisted that the whole series of events since 1570 had been a masterly plan conceived by Charles IX, and carried through by frequently misleading his mother and ministers as to his true intentions. The Venetian government refused to allow the work to be printed there, and it was eventually published in Rome in 1574, and in the same year quickly reprinted in Geneva in the original Italian and a French translation. It was in this context that the massacre came to be seen as a product of Machiavellianism, a view greatly influenced by the Huguenot Innocent Gentilet, who published his Discours contre Machiavel in 1576, which was printed in 10 editions in 3 languages over the next 4 years. Gentilet held, quite wrongly according to Sidney Anglo, that Machiavelli's books held most dear and precious by our Italian and Italianized courtiers, and so, at the root of France's present degradation, which has culminated not only in the St.Bartholomew massacre but the glee of its perverted admirers. In fact, there is little trace of Machiavellian French writings before the massacre, and not very much after, until Gentilet's own book. But this concept was seized upon by many contemporaries, and played a crucial part in setting the long-lasting popular concept of Machiavellianism that so infuriates scholars of his actual thought. It also gave added impetus to the strong anti-Italian feelings already present in Huguenot polemic. Christopher Marlowe was one of many Elizabethan writers who were enthusiastic proponents of these ideas. In The Jew of Malta, Machiavel in person speaks the prologue, claiming to not be dead, but to have possessed the soul of Guise, and now that Guise is dead, is come from France, to view this land, and frolic with his friends. His last play, The Massacre at Paris, takes the massacre, and the following years, as its subject, with Guise and Catherine both depicted as Machiavellian plotters bent on evil from the start. The Catholic Encyclopedia of 1913 was still ready to endorse a version of this view, describing the massacres as an entirely political act committed in the name of the immoral principles of Machiavellianism, and blaming the pagan theories of a certain raison d'equité, according to which the end justified the means. The French 18th century historian Louis-Pierre Anquetil, in his Esprit de la Ligue of 1767, was among the first to begin impartial historical investigation, emphasizing the lack of premeditation in the massacre and that Catholic mob violence had a history of uncontrollable escalation. By this period the massacre was being widely used by Voltaire and other Enlightenment writers in polemics against organized religion in general. The question of whether the massacre had long been premeditated was not entirely settled until the late 19th century. Lord Acton changed his mind on the matter twice, finally concluding that it was not.